Greetings, everyone. This is Virtuous Roots, where we reclaim virtue to bring into our home and yours. And I'm Thomas McCuddy.
And I'm Thomas Quackenbush.
And we are again without Nick Wiegand tonight. He is still on vacation. Nicholas? We're Nicholas?
Yep.
So we are. But so we're getting a theme, having a conversation about we've talked about a few things, and I want to talk really about the virtue of silence and the place of silence in our lives. So we're going to learn about silence starting now. Just kidding. So we will actually talk about, after you can't go too long, people are going to reach for the radio dials.
Yeah.
No. So in all seriousness, when Nick's away, boys will play.
Yeah, exactly.
So in all seriousness, there's we live in a world that's noisy. We live in a world where, particularly now, I think with smartphones, it's not just the noise of, and I'll extend this. It's not just the noise of actual loud sounds, but there's a sense of as you're on your phone and you're constantly getting the exposure and you're seeing the things and the videos are playing, that it does create almost this cacophony, this just chaos. But I think all of that leads into the overstimulation. All that leads into, I think there's some, they've been doing these studies, they've been talking about how that just in some ways rewires our brains.
Yeah.
And I think this is why the virtue of silence, the concept of why silence is good for us, is, I think what happens is again, you have people like, no, I want constant noise, and have to, and I don't know if this is just a cultural thing. I don't know if this is in other places in the world, but when I'm out and about, and sometimes people have their phones out and they're playing music out loud.
Oh man!
Like they're not even willing. Like they don't have headphones, so they're just going to play it out loud. That happened to us on an airplane one time. We were on the plane, and a young lady had her phone just blasting not even good music. Like I guess it's one thing. I guess if the music's good, maybe it's a little forgivable, but it's just awful. And I'm seeing this more and more. And even like little kids at restaurants will have their tablets and they'll be playing. And we just can't get away from this stimulation that comes from hearing all these things all the time. So I think it's worth having kind of a conversation how to seek silence in a virtuous manner, because it's not just, well, just cut off everything and just sit in a quiet room. That's again itself an vice. You know, we don't want to go too far.
Yep.
So we need to sort of hone in on what is the best way to utilize silence, why we need this, and how this will help us actually be more virtuous humans. Well,
it's interesting because the need for silence for me, I'm introverted by nature. Grew up an only child, so I'm accustomed to being in a lot of long periods of silence because my parents were at work. I would just be at home, and I now as an adult with a family, I require it. Like I need to find like a place where there's nothing going on, and I can actually. It's almost like my mind can just like be at peace, because you don't realize how much stimulation it's a constant, like how much it's affecting you. And we talked a little bit, about leisure. Well, I don't know if it's going to be released this week or the week after, but you'll connect a little bit with that. Finding a place where, because Jesus would, you see in the scriptures and in the gospels where he would just separate himself and find that place of silence and get away from the cacophony of different voices and different things tugging at him. Because that's the other aspect of this too, because with all of this going on, there's all these things that you need to do and all this, stuff that needs to get done or whatever. And it's pulling you away from this place because you want to find that place of silence, that place of rest. But your mind's like, oh, I can't do that right now. I can't do that right now. And then over time, you just that desire, that need is actually being dissolved in all of your activities again. And you're like, oh, then you don't realize why you're being irritable or you're being frustrated so easily. And that's I'm talking from my own experience. And one of those things too, it's funny because like I like to drive with I'll usually occasionally I'll have music on. Like mostly if I was going to put anything on, it'd be a book. But usually the book starts talking and then I lose myself in thought and I'm like, all right, you got to be quiet because I want to think. I just have the desire. It just gets me into that mind space where I can just think about things. I have this period of time where I'm by myself. And I think the car is always a good place for that. And I can just be quiet. And I know and both you and I, we travel, we don't put music on, typically. And we have our conversations and we're excited. And early on in the trip, our coffee is kicking in and then it starts wearing off and we just go into our own places as we're driving until we need to wake up and start talking again. But we by nature have this desire. And for me, it's interesting because that is something that I have by nature. But my wife, on the other hand, was one that had a hard time in quiet places. Like she needs the noise. And she's starting to learn, like she's starting to get to like, we don't put music on, we're driving, we have a good conversation. We have moments of silence. We're comfortable enough around each other just to have that. But it took a while for her to really realize that. And she's like, I can't turn it all off. I can't. Like her mind is just running a mile a minute, and the silence just exacerbates that to the point where she's overwhelmed, and she has to go find something to do that.
So I think that takes us back to the idea of virtues are habits, and habits are trained over time. And I was reading. Actually, my part of what we've been talking about, we're now in the States going into our summer months and going into this time where we have a little bit more time off sort of in leisure. And I've got my summer reading list. And I'm going through and deep diving more into what it means that these virtues are habits. They have to be cultivated. And the reason they're called habits, and the reason we talk about these virtues the way we do, is because by nature, they're hard to change.
Yep.
That if you could just flip a switch and now you're different, that's not a habit. That you might have a disposition. I think this is what they were drawing this line. You might be disposed to be in a certain way, but if you can just quickly change that, it wasn't a habit.
Yep.
Habits, and we typically use the word habit in a bad way, but we should have habits that are good. And that's why they are virtues, is because they've got us in this mode of operation. So in relation, and I understand what, particularly with your wife, because my parents were ones who always left the TV on. Nobody's watching it, but the TV's going. Yep. And it was just so noisy. And my wife, we would go back to my parents' house and visit, and she's like, why is the TV on? Why is there so much noise? And we would get it where it was quiet, and then it would almost be unsettling for my parents. But again, after decades of being this way, they've built a habit. And so this is why pursuing silence virtuously, I think, is so important for us, is that we need to build a habit that when it's time to unplug, we can do that. Yep. We can function without the noise. But to also recognize that there's a good use for the noise. Like I like the music. I like, we have different streaming means of playing music. I have to have multiple because my kids sometimes will start streaming and then I can't listen because we don't have the family plan. So if I want to hear music, I got to have multiple ways, and I have them. But the idea that there's those times where I don't need the music, I need to quiet my mind. Many of the philosophers we read, they'll talk about that you need to have the kind of mind that can be settled, that can sit with its own thoughts. And this is why I like the idea of retreats. You're able to unplug, get away from things. And it allows your mind to settle. And if you're unaccustomed to that, and I think this is where some people who are hearing this, they might think, I can't stand to be in a quiet room. You have to start small. You have to start slow. And I was even thinking about this even today as I was working, I have this habit where as I'm working, particularly if I'm doing editing, like I can only edit for a little bit and I want to shift off somewhere. So we'll call this visual noise. I need to go look over here. I need to go do something else and come back. And I can't just focus right there. And I've almost told myself, I need to, this makes me more productive by not doing what I need to do. The lies we tell ourselves, right? So I've realized to build this habit, I remember sitting there and I'm having to fight the urge. I'm having to change how I function. I'm having to consciously decide I'm going to quiet my mind and I'm going to focus on what I need to do. And as a practical, people are like, well, how do you do that? So of all things, I just went online And I was looking for really just kind of like one of those, like a clock or some sort of countdown timer. Like I'm going to give myself an hour, 1 hour focus. And I didn't like the whole like times and seconds. Like it just kind of stressed me out. Like I was like, oh, I feel like I'm in the race. Yep. So I found actually online, it was really cool. It was a candle. Like I think it's actually a little kid counter, but it worked for me. It was a picture of a candle, and it had the hour, and over the hour the candle went small. So I had the candle literally just on the side of my screen, just kind of showing me, reminding me, okay, here's my focus time. And again, no sounds, no music, no. Sometimes when I'm editing, I'll even have like TV shows or something like streaming, something to distract me. And I just pushed all that away. And there's something liberating to being able to work like that, to focus like that, to function like that. I think that's what we're missing out on when we sort of drop or bypass this virtue of silence.
It's interesting too, because I mean, not to disparage our modern technology, I mean, but you think about the candle idea too, because at one point in time, that was like all you had was that hour, because once that candle goes out, you have no more light, because it just that was your light. and you think of it, because we read, I mean, both of us reread, through the centuries. Like I don't read much stuff that was written, in this present century or the previous one as much as I do with the, back in, classical periods and the medieval periods, where all they had they didn't have the electricity. They didn't have, this, phones that are constantly vying for their attention. Like the phone, like constantly just bleep, every time I try to put it away, there's notifications come up. There's people calling. There's always all this stuff going on. So to always, even when I try, I literally have to put it out of my, I have to hide it somewhere so it doesn't distract me anymore. But at that, like I think about all these fantastic thinkers in the past and all that they're able to accomplish in their lives, and it's because they didn't have the like they literally just didn't have the distractions. And it's like, as modern people, we have issues with having to deal with this.
It was Norm Geisler, because he wrote 90-something books before he passed away, and they took his manuscripts, finished it. It capped 100. And someone asked him, like, how do you write so much? How do you do this? And his reply was, it's amazing what you can do if you don't watch TV.
Yeah.
that was it. I mean, he's like, I don't sit and I don't watch TV. And he did. He represented one who, again, through those habits, he didn't need that.
Yep.
And he was able to do so much. And it was sort of mind-boggling, but that's because we don't have those kinds of habits.
No. And we don't desire those things. It's because you think about that, like my wife, and I'm not, she doesn't listen to us too much, pick up on this and get myself in trouble. But she'll make excuses like, I don't have time, because we always want to like find some way of, getting in shape and exercising. And I like to run and I like to do other things. It gets a little bit annoying in the summer because it's so hot here. But so I have to like do other things to do my exercises. But she's always complaining like, well, you have time and I don't. And I'm like, well, you do. Like, and it's hard because like, you have time where you're watching the television. Like that's literally just taking, you don't need to do that. You can take that time and actually put it to productive means. And I know this is going a little away from the silence aspect, but we tend to fill our time with all that noise, and it distracts us from things that we could do that are much, I guess, more virtuous. We can say it that way. Because I find, because I refuse during the weeks, the TV doesn't go on. Like it doesn't go on. But I also wanted to talk about, like, because we talked a little bit, and we're talking about this difference between like a natural disposition, which I have the desire to be in a silent place and quiet. That's like, that's my default. The problem is like, there's also the idea that can be a vice because it's just my natural disposition. It's not something I work towards. So I, like when my family does come home, like my daughter and my wife come home, and there's that chaos of everybody coming home from school or, coming home from work. And I get really, really like, it just jars me so much now that this noise is introduced, where I just like, and my wife, she'll see me go off and want to find my like place by myself. And she's like, don't you want to spend time with me? I'm like, I do, but I just like right now, like there's so much commotion. I need to like adjust to it.
But you're basically like one of your cats and you go and you run under the bed.
Yes, pretty much. And I learned a lot from them. They know, if you want to know like an animal that can teach you a little bit about leisure time and silence, that's a cat can do that. But it's true because it's like, I need a balance, and I need that's the other extreme. If you are that introverted person that needs the desires to be by themselves, like that's also a place, you can have too much silence where you do need to enter into like the world of commotion. Sometimes you need to order that commotion. Like you have to be that, especially being the father in home. Like if there's a lot of commotion, my kids are getting on each other's nerves. I have to go in there and intervene. I can't just avoid it because it's loud, or they're being, they're driving each other nuts. So there is that as well.
I think that brings us to Ecclesiastes 3, because this is where, Solomon, in his famous poem, songs have been written about this, but in Ecclesiastes 3:7, he talks about, there's a time to tear and a time to sow, and there's a time to keep silence and a time to speak.
Yep.
Which is simple enough. Okay, yeah, there's a time to be silent, time to speak. But I think where we lack prudence, we lack our wisdom, is knowing when those are and to put those into practice. Mm-hmm. Because like you said, there's a time, and in our homes, we have specific quiet times during the school day. Like we'll actually, like I know when that is. Not just because if I forget, I suddenly listen. I'm like, it's really quiet in here. Or one of my kids comes into my office and he's going to be reading a book. Or they can even listen to an audiobook during quiet time with headphones. Mm-hmm. And they can, we have specific devices for this. But
Yep.
The whole purpose is we're going to sort of break away and we're going to have this time. And my kids actually look forward to it. They enjoy that. Like if my oldest doesn't get his quiet time, he's sort of offended. He's like, I'm going to get my quiet time somehow. But that's because, again, there's a time for that. But then there's also the time when it's time to play. It's time to be noisy. And even today, I recognize, I just kind of had like a little bit of a lull. And one of the things we're trying to do in our summer vacation time, as we're going into June and July, is we're trying to play more board games as a family. Mm-hmm. And I found out, we went to a board game store the other day and found out, it was like, hey, look, this game has an expansion. And my wife said, we already have the expansion. I was like, oh, fair. Okay, my bad.
It hasn't expanded yet.
Yeah, so let's figure this out. So I did this with the boys today. And they were like, this is random. I was like, well, it's a good time for it.
Yep.
Recognizing the time and recognizing what you should be doing with that. And in this conversation about silence, I think that's why we're focusing there, because I think we live in cultures where the problem is not the silence, the problem is the noise.
Yep.
And learning how to bring that back to the middle, learning how to balance that.
Yep.
So what would be some practical suggestions that you would have that have worked for your family? Because again, we both have 3 kids. It can get, and our kids are about the same age, so it can be noisy.
Well, it's interesting because my oldest son, your oldest son, they're similar in that way. They like both of them like board games. They both like card games. They both they get along really well in that area. And well, for us, it's like because of the distractions of the Xbox and the television and stuff. Like some of that pulling away from all that noise from whatever medium that you're watching is a form of silence for us. And even though we come together and we play a board game together, my son also likes playing chess, and that's a place, like when you're playing chess, it's pretty quiet. Like it's a place where you just don't, like, you're thinking and you're strategizing. And so my older son, my middle son likes playing chess. He just kind of messes around as much, but my older son's more like more strategic in that way, and me and him have some good matches. But also I think about, like, as we to bring in, going a little different direction for a second, the idea that what is this, like, meditation, or as we're told to meditate on God's word. Like, mm-hmm. When do we do that? Do we do it when there's a lot of different things going on, or do we do that when everything's silent and we can think about it? And where do we have that time of reflection with God, and like that we're supposed to have. And I think, silence is the place to do that. And I think that's precisely why Jesus separated himself from the crowds to commune with the Father.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when do we I think this idea of finding a place of solitude individually too. And I think, I was talking a little bit about as a family coming together, but, and I like what your family does is that they separate and for that period of time where you read, do whatever, but also meditation, a Christian meditation isn't like the Eastern religions where you're trying to silence your mind and not think about anything.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a purpose, we want the silence, but we want also the time of reflection and a time of contemplation as we think about God. And we can read the Bible and use that I use it as a kind of springboard into those types of thoughts. I'll read a passage and I'm like, I want to think about it. I'm like, I want to struggle through a tough verse. And I'm like, what does this mean? And I ask those questions, and then that brings me in this place where, I can only do that when it's silent, when I'm not being distracted by a million different things.
I think that's the key, though, is that we are not practiced in just sitting and thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, again, we got to keep the noise. We got to keep moving, keep the doing, that productivity.
Yep.
What are you doing with your time? I think this is why, again, several of the people and the philosophers we tend to read, they push back against this idea that you always have to be doing, and that the idea of true wisdom and philosophy, you don't do anything with it. It is to reflect, let the mind sort of bask
Mm-hmm.
in the truth and to work on those things. That is an entirely lost art in our culture. That's something that that's why within this August, when we're looking to start a homeschool co-op,
Mm-hmm.
and we're working through the ideas of actual genuine Christian philosophy
Yep.
as leisure, as letting your mind work on these ideas. It's counter to our whole education system.
Yep.
It's because we do this with the one class on the wisdom literature at the Bible college where
Mm-hmm.
I'm at, that I tell the students this is going to be different because the vast majority of this class is for you to reflect and learn how to pursue wisdom. And it's difficult because it doesn't fit on a rubric very well. How do you grade this? And I tell them, that we're going to play kind of loose and free with this because I want them to learn. I want them to experience that there can be more than just mining books for information, but just to let your mind sit and dwell. And that's what I tell them. I was like, find time to sit in the silence.
Mm-hmm.
Here's scripture for your mind to work on. Because like I said, the Eastern meditation is all like, we joke about meditating on the navel, and that's why they just clear the mind and they spend all their time. I watched actually the Dalai Lama was doing an interview, and he was talking about meditating and how he works so hard to basically keep his mind empty constantly. Like he's like, whenever you're in the car, you go into your meditative state and you just blank your mind. And that is not how we as Christians are supposed to function. It's much more letting the mind be quiet and still. It's what happens when we reflect on the scripture.
Mm-hmm.
When we, in a sense, as we're praying to the Lord, that sometimes we have with the liturgical churches that have the written prayers, and again, our church is not liturgical at all, but I do enjoy having those because I don't have to sit and come up with the words. I can just reflect. I can think on these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the suggestion. That's why as we look in guiding our families, making sure our families have that space, they have that place, and we work that into the culture of our family.
Yep.
Because I think, again, it goes back to it. And I think where a lot of this motivation came from is that I remember, particularly when my kids were younger, and it just seemed like every day was chaos. Every day was loud. Lots of, little kids screaming because particularly, when you got babies, there's going to be noise. When you have little kids, they're getting hurt or they're hurting each other. That sort of happens today that sometimes, it's like everything's quiet and all of a sudden one kid screams out. Yep. It's like, what happened? Self-inflicted or, brotherly love? Like what happened here? And so those things happen, and we try to teach them it's not necessary to scream.
Yeah.
But, when that kind of goes on, it is disconcerting to our souls. There is a sense of soul care in seeking that quiet, seeking that and making that a part of you.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like I said, and like you mentioned, because I can do this too. I can run away, and I've used it in a way of dismissing others. Like, I'm done with you.
Yeah.
I'm gone. So I want to encourage families, as you're thinking about this, over holiday or whatever time you have, however you spend, what can you do in your family not to, how can we just all be quiet together? That's not the function. How can we learn to incorporate silence and being able to, as a choice, quiet our souls quickly? That, at this point in time, we're gonna be quiet. If we don't have that habit, we're never going to be able to do that.
Exactly.
It's not going to be part of our lives. But Thomas, thank you for the conversation.
Yep.
You can find our podcast, Virtuous Roots, on all major streaming platforms. You can find more information about Families of Virtue at our website, familiesofvirtue.com. And we will see you next time.